Okay, looks good.
Okay. Hello, everyone who's joined. Hopefully you can all see the screen in front of you. It should say take part in National Mammal Week and hear me all right. We're just going to wait till 1 p.m. Before starting properly, just to give everyone a chance to join. Okay, so I've just had a message from someone that they couldn't see me, so I just wanted to check that audience members can see what's on the screen currently. Could someone put in the chat if everything's good? Okay, all good, great. Okay, so welcome to this webinar. Before I hand over to our wonderful speaker today, I'd just like to take you through what's happening this week, because as you may all be aware, it's a very special week this week. It is in fact National Mammal Week. So we are actually exploring the world of forgotten and underrepresented mammals across the British Isles, and also what mammal conservation might look like in the near future. So if there's just one thing that I'd like you all to try and take part in this week, it's our Big Mammal Challenge. So this is a big citizen science project that we are running across the British Isles, where you can enter any data you have on sightings of mammals you get this week. So whether that's in-person sightings, videos or footage from camera traps, or even footprint tunnels you can make and set out in your garden. You can enter all of these on the Mammal Mapper app, which you can download on the Apple or Google Play Store. So if you'd like any more information about the Big Mammal Challenge or anything else to do with the National Mammal Week, then make sure to just head to our website and you can find all the information there on how to survey mammals and download the app. So welcome to the webinar. So today we're talking all about the evolutionary history of mammals, from the dinosaurs to us. And we have with us today our wonderful speaker, Steve Brusatte. Hopefully I pronounced your surname correctly that time. And he is a professor of paleontology and evolution at the University of Edinburgh. Now, Steve is a specialist in all things mammal and dinosaur evolution. He's named and described over 20 new species, and he's also a best-selling author of the books The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs and The Rise and Reign of the Mammals. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Steve. Steve, if you'd like to try and share your screen, hopefully that will work.
All right. Hopefully you're seeing some woolly mammoths and some saber-toothed tigers there. So great. So thanks a lot for the invitation to speak. A big thanks to Hope for all the logistics putting this together. And happy Mammal Week. This is really neat. And so I know one of the purposes of the week is to celebrate some of the less heralded mammals and to just get involved, to get, talking about mammals, thinking about mammals, the mammals that we don't always see or maybe experience. And I'm going to do that, but in a very different way. And I'm going to talk about the history of mammals, fossil mammals, some of the extinct species that have lived over the course of Earth history, that have been the ancestors and the cousins of the mammals that live today. And really, it's these extinct mammals that help tell the story of where mammals came from. And of course, that's our own story as mammals. So when I study fossil mammals, I really see in these fossils the deepest roots of humanity and the 6,000 plus other species of mammals that are around with us today. So the talk I'm going to give is really going to be a broad overview of the history of mammals. It's going to be 325 million years of evolution in 45 minutes or so. And for me, I'm a paleontologist who studies fossils and evolution. A lot of the work that I've done in my career has been on dinosaurs. I've dug up dinosaurs. I've studied dinosaur evolution. I've written books about dinosaurs. That's the primary thing I was trained in. But over the years, I've become much more interested in mammals alongside the dinosaurs, really because the dinosaurs had their time, then the mammals had their time. And so the story really is one continuous story. And a few years ago, I followed up my dinosaur book with one on mammals called The Rise and Reign of the Mammals. And this is a pop science book that tells the story I'm going to tell you today, but it does so in a little bit more detail, hopefully with a little bit more gusto. So I would humbly say if you're interested in this subject, you like the talk, you might be interested in checking out the book. Okay, so when it comes to mammals, when it comes to the story of mammals, oftentimes I think there's this stereotype, if you will, that the dinosaurs ruled the world, then the dinosaurs died out. A big asteroid hit the Earth, the dinosaurs were incinerated, wiped away, and then mammals evolved to take their place. And that story is partially true, but it's not quite the full story. Certainly dinosaurs did have their day. Dinosaurs did die out, except for birds. And mammals were the animals that really replaced dinosaurs as far as a diverse group of animals that grew to large sizes and spread around the world and filled lots of ecological niches. That part is true. But the mammals did not evolve after the asteroid. They did not evolve in order to replace the dinosaurs. They were already there. They survived the asteroid. That's what allowed our mammal ancestors to overcome the dinosaurs. And so I want to tell you that story, and then also what happened after mammals took over the dinosaurs. So we're going to go back in time, zoom back to about 325 million years ago, back when the world looked like this. This was the time of the supercontinent. Pangea was coming together. It wasn't quite there yet, but the land was all converging around the equator, a giant ice cap on the South Pole, but much of what is Europe and North America today was located right near the equator. It was hot, it was humid, it was subtropical, and this was the world of the coal forests. Some of the very first jungles in Earth history, where trees stretched up 100 feet into the canopy, and there was so much oxygen being released by those trees that many animals achieved ludicrous sizes. There were dragonflies the size of seagulls and millipedes bigger than humans slithering around in the undergrowth. And these are the coal swamps because it's when these trees were buried that they turned into a lot of the coal that we mine today here in the UK, but also back in the middle part of America where I'm from. And where I'm from, not too far south of Chicago, there's a very famous fossil site where amongst the coal seams you find these beautiful plants and also some of the little animals living in the swamps, entombed in these rusty red nodules. And when I was a teenager, I would go and look for these fossils. That's me and my brothers in this grainy old photograph, scouring the old tips and spoil piles from the coal mines looking for these fossils. And what I always wanted to find but never did was a fossil of something with bones and hands and feet and arms and legs, what we call a tetrapod, an animal with bones that live on the land. And I knew that around this time that these fossils were forming, there were animals like this living in North America that have been found at other fossil sites. And this is a little creature called Archaeopteryx, a humble little thing, really. It could fit in the palm of your hands. It looks, I think, kind of like maybe a little chameleon, a little gecko, something like that. A very inconspicuous creature, but a very important creature, because Archaeopteryx, which lived about 325 million years ago, give or take, was the very first synapsid. It's the first known member of a major group on the family tree of life. And that group is distinguished by one quite subtle but very important characteristic, and that is that synapsids have a hole in their head behind the eye socket. And you can see the skull of Archaeopteryx there. That arrow is pointing to this hole. What good is a hole in the head? Well, in this case, that hole held jaw muscles. So basically, it allowed the jaw muscles to be bigger, to provide stronger bites for these animals. So they had more powerful, stronger jaws. Now, there's a human skull there to the right, and there's an arrow there. And what that arrow is pointing to is something that you can feel if you put your hand on your cheek and kind of move your jaw around. You can feel there's some muscles in there. What you're feeling are the muscles in that hole. We have a hole in our head behind our eye. It's kind of merged with our eye socket, but it's there. That's because we are a synapsid too. Mammals, all mammals are synapsids. Mammals descend from these early coal swamp creatures like Archaeopteryx that evolved that hole in their head. And really what happened about 325 million years ago is that there was a great split on the family tree of life. And so amongst those animals with bones and arms and legs, those tetrapod animals living on land, there was a divergence. One side of the family tree went towards what we call the diapsids. And this is a very diverse group that includes lizards and snakes and turtles and crocodiles, but also dinosaurs and birds, a huge diversity. The other side of that family tree went towards the synapsids. They evolved that hole in their head behind their eye. And today, there's only one type of synapsid that remains. These are the mammals. But for about 100 million years, beginning with those first coal swamp animals, there was a whole motley crew of primitive, archaic synapsids that were living and evolving and spreading around the world and thriving. And it was these early synapsids that developed one by one many of the keystone features of mammals, of the body of mammals, of the behavior of mammals, of the biology of mammals. So we can find the roots of a lot of our own features, our own biology in these early synapsids. Now, as the Carboniferous period, that time of the coal swamps, turned into the next interval of time, which is called the Permian period, all of the land now had come together. There's one single supercontinent centered on the equator. This was a tough place to live. If you were in the middle of that supercontinent, you were thousands of miles from the ocean. Vast deserts covered much of the land. But, as is always the case in Earth history, there were plants and animals adapted to that world. And some of the animals that achieved dominion on this supercontinent, that became the biggest meat eaters and plant eaters, the top of the food chain, were synapsids. And the most exemplary one of these is this animal here called Dimetrodon, this snarling creature with a big sail on its back. Now, you might think this is a dinosaur, and you'd be totally forgiven if you do, because a lot of times you see this animal in the dinosaur toy sets and on dinosaur posters. It's even in the Jurassic World films now, some of them. it looks kind of like a dinosaur, right? It's like this snarling, primeval, archaic, reptilian, brutish creature. So your mind might automatically go towards dinosaur. But actually, Dimetrodon has a hole in its head behind its eye. It is a synapsid. It is more closely related to us than it is to any dinosaur. And it's synapsids like Dimetrodon that spread around the supercontinent and became the dominant animals at the time. And it looked like they would remain dominant for countless years, generations, millions of years to come. But then something happened, something chaotic and terrible and unpredictable. And what happened was these enormous volcanoes in Russia started to erupt. And these were not normal volcanoes. You know, this was not one of the Hawaiian volcanoes just spewing out a little bit of lava. This was not Mount St. Helens or Pinatubo blowing its top and releasing some ash. You know, it wasn't anything like that. These were essentially enormous fissures in the earth that opened up and they spewed out tsunamis of lava. Lava poured out of these wounds in the earth for hundreds of thousands of years. And that lava covered more area, more land area than all of Europe put together. It was catastrophic for anything living in the vicinity of these volcanoes. But the real problem was that as that lava came up through the earth, it burnt through the crust and it released carbon dioxide and methane and all these nasty, toxic greenhouse gases that, as we know today, can warm the planet. And they did back then. And this led to runaway global warming. And this became some of the biggest and most disruptive climate change in Earth history. It led to an extinction, and not just any extinction, but a mass extinction, one where maybe 95% of all species died out. The closest life has come to completely dying out ever since the first life evolved about 4 billion years ago. But those volcanoes did stop erupting. Some animals did survive, and imagine you're one of the survivors and you look out on this empty world now. 95% of other species perhaps are now gone, and this world is your frontier. And among these animals were one peculiar type of synapsid. These were called cynodonts, and these were smaller animals. They had hair that covered their bodies, helped keep their bodies warm, but not just that, their body temperatures consistent as climate was changing around them. And they had bigger brains than other animals at the time, and they were able to dig. They dug burrows, they could hide away. These were the key traits that allowed them to survive the carnage of that extinction. And these things basically were the immediate ancestors of mammals. So as the Permian period turned into the next interval of time, the Triassic period, these surviving cynodonts were poised to evolve and diversify. The supercontinent is still there. The volcanoes are done. This is now a new world to be conquered, and those cynodonts are primed to do it. However, there's one problem, one big problem. And that is that some other animals survived that extinction too. There were some reptiles that survived the extinction, and those little reptiles turned into the dinosaurs. And it was in the Triassic period on Pangaea that true dinosaurs originated alongside the first true mammals, the descendants of those cynodonts. And I think that's remarkable. Dinosaurs and mammals have the same origin story. The aftermath of that terrible extinction, back on the supercontinent of Pangaea in the Triassic period. Now, from that point on, all the way up until today, frankly, the fates of dinosaurs and mammals have been intertwined. But they were destined for different things. Dinosaurs were destined for grandeur, and eventually some became enormous, some became bigger than jet airplanes, large, giant, colossal, dominant animals. Some dinosaurs were small, of course, some evolved feathers and wings and took to the sky as birds, but a lot of dinosaurs were the big animals that were on top of the food chain. Mammals did the opposite, and mammals went small. And the very first true mammals were animals that looked like this, little things that were just the size of mice or shrews. If you saw them, you could hold one very comfortably on the palm of your hand, and it would have looked like a little mouse. And really the thing that made these things true mammals is a subtle feature of their anatomy their jaw bones, lower jaw bones, became reduced. The ancestors of mammals had lots of bones in their lower jaws. We and all other mammals only have one, the jawbone. And so that helped these early mammals bite stronger, chew their food. It was also part of the changes to the teeth. These early mammals evolved molar teeth and premolar teeth, canines, incisors, the different teeth along the jaws that do different jobs. Teeth that when they come together, the top and the bottom, they can bite very strongly. They can chew their food because they interlock very well. And mammals only have two sets of teeth, baby teeth and adult teeth. That all has to do with feeding babies milk, something else they were evolving. So all of these changes were happening as cynodonts gave rise to true mammals. And because the ancestors of these true mammals had lots of bones in their lower jaw, mammals only have one bone. That meant that a lot of bones no longer were needed to be part of the jaw. Some of those bones disappeared. Some of them became tiny, migrated into the ear, and became some of those little delicate bones that we have in our ears that help us and other mammals hear sound really, really well. Mammals are expert hearers. So all of these changes were happening as those cynodonts that survived the Great Extinction went small and lived alongside, were competing with, were trying to avoid the dinosaurs. And just to show you some scale here, this is what the skulls of these very first mammals looked like. This is from CAT scans of fossils. Then there's some artwork there showing digitally, putting some hair on there, some whiskers showing what we think they would have looked like. But at the bottom there is one of the actual fossil jawbones of one of these first mammals. And it is tiny. That is a grain of rice next to it for scale. So you can see just how small these first mammals were. And they would remain that way. For the next 160 million years or so, mammals lived with dinosaurs, but no mammal ever got bigger than a badger. Remarkable. But don't think that these mammals were boring, unsuccessful, failures, anything like that. Quite the opposite. Because the more we learn, the more that we see these mammals living with the dinosaurs, although they were small, they were very successful, very diverse in their own ways. And this evidence really has just emerged over about the past 25 years or so. And it comes from this part of China, a place called Liaoning province, way tucked up in the northeastern part of the country. Shares a long border with North Korea, a land of factories, rolling hills, farmland. And about 25 years ago, farmers started to find these remarkable fossils when they started to split open rocks that they found out on their land. And these were fossils that were formed when entire ecosystems were buried by volcanoes back in the Cretaceous period, about 125 million years ago. So these whole ecosystems were overcome, kind of like Pompeii when Mount Vesuvius erupted. So all of these animals were locked in stone as fossils. And even these tiny, delicate mammals were preserved. And these mammals tell us that, yes, all these mammals are small, but they were diverse. Some of these mammals are scurriers, some are tree climbers, some are burrowers, some could swim, some could even glide through the canopy on wings made of skin. So, for 160 million years, yes, mammals were small. Dinosaurs kept them small. Mammals probably just couldn't get bigger in a world of brontosauruses and T-Rexes. But conversely, the mammals kept the dinosaurs big. And what I mean by that is mammals were so good at being small, at living in those hidden niches, those underground niches, those nocturnal niches, coming out at night, living in the shadows. They were so good at doing that that you never saw a T-Rex the size of a mouse or a Triceratops the size of a rat. No, because mammals were the kings and queens of those small-bodied, underground, incognito ecological niches during the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods. Now, as mammals evolved and diversified in those small-bodied niches, the continents continued to move around. By the end of the Cretaceous period, about 66 million years ago, the world would have looked a lot like it does today. Not exactly, but it was becoming a much more recognizable world to us with many separate continents. And then one day, one Tuesday afternoon in the spring, it was in the spring, we think, this enormous rock, a 6-mile wide rock, fell out of the sky. Could have gone anywhere. It's a piece of space junk. It was an asteroid, traveling more than 10 times faster than a speeding bullet, hurtling through the heavens. It made a beeline for the Earth. It smashed into what is now Mexico with the force of over 1 billion nuclear bombs put together. It punched a hole in the crust of the Earth more than 100 miles wide, and it unleashed chaos. Probably the single worst day in the history of the Earth. Tsunamis, wildfires, earthquakes, hurricane-force wind, all the dust and dirt and grime and soot from the collision and the fires went up into the atmosphere, blocked out the sun, turned the Earth dark and cold for several years. This was disaster. And dinosaurs were there to witness it. T-Rex itself was there the day the asteroid hit. Triceratops was there, as were many mammals. Now the dinosaurs, they had been ruling the world for a long time. They'd been so successful for a long time, but the world changed so quickly they could not cope. And the problem was, it seems most dinosaurs were pretty big. They needed a lot of food to eat. It took them a long time to grow from a baby into an adult. They couldn't hide very easily. Those things were handicaps when the Earth changed so quickly around them. One type of dinosaur did have the right combination of talents and features to make it through, and those were birds that could fly, that could move easily, that could eat seeds with their beaks, and so on. But all the other dinosaurs died out. Now, many mammals died too. Maybe 9 out of every 10 mammal species, based on some estimates in the fossil record, may have died out. Overall, 75% of everything died out. This was catastrophe. But some mammals, a small number, also had what it took to stare down that asteroid and make it out on the other side. And these mammals got through probably because they were smaller, they could hide easily, they had omnivorous diets, so they could eat lots of different types of food, and they grew really quickly. So basically they were flexible, adaptable. That's what allowed them to survive this worst moment in Earth history. So a lot of the work that we've done is collecting fossils of these very last dinosaurs, and then the mammals that took their place. And one of the best places in the world to do that is in New Mexico, in the southwestern part of America. And out here in the Badlands, and land that once belonged to the Navajo, many of the tribes are still very active in this area, but this was all once land belonging to the Navajo and the Pueblo tribes. There's ancient human history there, remarkable human history, but even more ancient mammal history and dinosaur history. And we find fossils of some of these pioneering mammals, the ones that made it through the extinction, and then on the other side began to diversify like crazy in this new landscape where dinosaurs were gone. And these are some of the fossils we find, amazing fossils, skulls and jaws and teeth, and sometimes even skeletons. And most of the mammals we find in New Mexico are of a certain special type of mammal. They're placental mammals. They're ones like us that are capable of giving live birth to well-developed babies, babies that develop for a long time in their mother's womb. Now, not all placentals do this. Of course, mice are placentals, rats are placentals. Their babies don't develop for a super long time, but placentals have the ability to develop their babies for a long time. And I think it's no surprise that in today's world, placentals make up the vast majority of mammals. There's about 6,500 species of mammals. We can argue about the exact number, as mammalogists like to do. But by and large, there's a few monotremes, ones that still lay eggs, that harken back to these primitive ancestral conditions of the mammals that once lived with dinosaurs. But they're just restricted to Australia and some of the surrounding areas. There's some marsupials, the ones that give birth to tiny little babies that they raise in pouches, kangaroos, koalas, possums, and so on, mostly in Australia and South America. They, in fact, were more widespread around the world back in the late Cretaceous before the asteroid. Then they were nearly wiped out. They found refuge in South America and Australia. That's why they're there. But the vast majority, about 95% of mammals today are placentals. All of the things here are placentals. Bats and whales and elephants and tigers and sloths and Muhammad Ali, everything in between, all placental mammals. And it is placental mammals that evolved with gusto after the asteroid. They are the ones that basically replaced the dinosaurs in many ecosystems. In order to do so, they had to grow big, and they started to grow big really quickly. Now remember, for 160 million years or so, there were mammals living with dinosaurs, but none of those mammals ever got bigger than a badger. In New Mexico alone, we have fossils of mammals the size of pigs only about 300,000 years after the asteroid. About 1,000,000 years after the asteroid, we have mammals the size of cows. So you can see these placental mammals were getting really big really fast. And that's just in New Mexico. In other parts of the world, some mammal groups may have been evolving even larger sizes even quicker. This is really rapid, remarkably rapid. And in fact, they got so big so fast that their brains didn't keep pace with their bodies. This was a remarkable and unexpected finding from Ornella Bertrand, a good friend and colleague of mine who studied with me here in Edinburgh. Ornella led a paper that was published a few years ago, a research paper. She published it in the journal Science. And Ornella used CAT scans to see inside the skulls of fossils, using the X-rays to see inside the skulls. That allowed her to build digital models of the brains of these fossil species and measure the size and shape of the brains. And what she found was after the asteroid, these surviving mammals got so big so fast, their bodies ballooned in size, their brains lagged behind. And it took about 10 million years for the brains to catch up. And then from there, brains started to evolve really fast and got bigger and bigger. And that's what led to our advanced intelligence. But for 10 million years after the extinction, the bodies of these mammals were getting so big that the brains were not keeping pace. And because it's brain size relative to body size that is more or less a correlate with intelligence and adaptability and problem solving and so on, we could say in kind of a glib way that these mammals were not really surviving and thriving because of their big brains. They were actually getting dumber for a period of time after the asteroid hit. And that's because growing their bodies in size was much more important. They were filling those niches left behind by T-Rexes and Triceratopses and these other giant dinosaurs. So you might then ask, how did they do it? How did these surviving placentals grow so big so fast? And we think we might know the answer. And this was a project led by another stellar young scientist who works with me, Greg Funston. And Greg is an expert at studying the growth of species, both living and extinct species. And Greg does what's called histology work, takes very thin slices of fossil bones and teeth, looks at them under the microscope. You can tell a lot of things that way. And one of the things that you can see is that there's daily lines of growth in teeth. The same is true of our teeth when they're developing. There's new little bits of enamel and dentin, the two major tissues in the teeth, that are laid down every day, and they leave these little lines. And you can count these lines, and that gives you a sense of how long the tooth developed. But there's one key thing here that really unlocks a great secret, and that is that we know from modern day mammals that there's two moments in the lifetime of a mammal where the chemical composition of the teeth changes quickly and dramatically. And those moments are birth and weaning, when a mammal stops drinking its mother's milk, starts eating solid food. And really, this is just because the diets and the circumstances of mammals change so quickly at birth and weaning that the whole chemical composition of their tooth changes. Long story short, Greg's been able to look at, analyze the chemistry of these teeth. He's able to find which of those lines or sets of daily lines match up to birth and weaning, and from that was able to calculate a chronology of the lives of some of these mammals living not long after the extinction, the ones that were getting bigger. And what he was able to find is that these mammals from New Mexico, they raise their babies in the womb for about 7 months. That's a long pregnancy. Maybe it seems a little short to us because 9 months is the norm for us, but just think about it for a second. Most animals lay eggs. Live birth is a rare thing, and especially live birth after gestating for so long inside the mother. That is a placental mammal superpower, and these earliest placentals living right after the extinction were already doing it. Now those babies, they were born at a pretty advanced state. They weighed several kilograms, and they grew quickly. They drank their mother's milk for about 1 month, then they started eating solid food. Within a year, they were reproducing themselves. So what we think is that it's that ability of placental mammals to raise their babies for a long time in the womb, in the safety of the womb, to raise their babies for a long time so they can give birth to larger babies. Those were the things that allowed their body size to grow so much so quickly after the extinction. So, the asteroid hits. Most dinosaurs die. Many mammals die. Some survive. The surviving placental mammals prosper and diversify. They get bigger. Their brains aren't really keeping pace for a while. By about 10 million years after the extinction, we start to see a world that really looks more modern to us. And there's a great fossil site in Germany that illustrates this. This is a place called Messel, and it's basically a big hole in the ground. It used to be a place where they mined oil shale before it became unprofitable. And then this big hole was going to be turned into a landfill. They were going to dump all the rubbish from Frankfurt into this hole. And the locals objected, and there's a long legal battle. And out on the other side, it was not turned into a landfill. Instead, it became a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Go figure, right? From a landfill to a World Heritage Site. The reason was because in those rocks that have oil in them, there are fossils, beautiful fossils of lots of different mammals that sadly fell into a lake to their death, were buried quickly on the bottom, turned into these exquisite fossils. And among these fossils are obvious mammals that clearly belong to some of the major groups that are around today. We have horses, rodents, even things like bats. So, 10 million years after the asteroid, by this time, not only were mammals thriving, but the types of mammals we have around us today were thriving, including some of the peculiar ones. Now, bats, to me, are just some of the most remarkable animals that have ever evolved. These were mammals that turned their skeletons into airplanes. It's only happened in pterodactyls, birds, and bats among animals with bones. It is so hard to turn your skeleton into something that can fly and flap about in the air, and bats did it. And once the first bats appear in the fossil record, they start to show up everywhere. They became the first truly global group of mammals because they could fly, because they could get around easier. And it was a remarkable transition, evolving from little mammals that probably lived in the trees and scurried around the branches into something that could fly. But it might not even have been the most remarkable transition that mammals were undertaking around this time. Now, this animal here, I don't know what it looks like to you, but when I see this animal, bear with me, it kind of looks like a wolf in scuba gear. Maybe you can see what I'm talking about. Look at that long snout, sharp teeth, snarly animal. Pretty clearly a meat eater, pretty ferocious. But look at those hands and feet. They're like flippers, like something a scuba diver would have. And that's because what you're looking at here is one of the very first whales. Whales evolved from mammals that lived on land, and those mammals went into the water and then changed their bodies completely so they could live in the open ocean. And we have a beautiful sequence of fossils, a transitional series showing step by step how this happened. And basically it's a story of how Bambi turned into Moby Dick. The ancestors of whales were these little mammals that had long legs and hooves that scurried around. The closest living relatives of whales are actually hippos. Whales are nested within the group of even-toed hoofed mammals. And their ancestors were these things like Indohyus here, small little creatures that looked like little deer. They went into the water, they became semi-aquatic, they eventually became true whales that could only live in the water, that couldn't go back on the land, that were ace swimmers with bodies that looked like submarines. And today, whales are, of course, still with us. They are some of the most remarkable animals on our planet. This is the blue whale that's on display at the Natural History Museum in London. And the blue whale is the largest mammal today. It's the largest mammal ever. And in fact, it's the largest animal that has ever lived, as far as we know. It's literally the size of a submarine. Now, just imagine, and I like to think about this sometimes, if blue whales were extinct and all we had were their giant petrified bones, surely we would hold them in as much esteem as we do any dinosaur. But they're still with us. Thankfully, they're still with us. But I think that means we don't really appreciate them enough. And they are heavily endangered, so many whales. So I think we need to be sure that these magnificent feats of evolution are able to endure. Truly remarkable animals. Now, whales were starting to spread around the world in what's called the Eocene period. This started about 10 million years after the asteroid hit. And as the Eocene unfolded and then transitioned into the next interval called the Oligocene, the world was changing. Not only were the continents still moving, but the climate was changing too. And global temperatures were becoming cooler. It was a gradual thing, but it's all had to do with the shape of the Earth's orbit and the direction of ocean currents, these kind of things. But the Earth was gradually becoming cooler, and that meant that a lot of jungles, which at one time in the Eocene, when the whales were first swimming around, there were jungles that stretched all the way up into the North Pole. These jungles, as the Earth cooled, started to disappear. They started to retreat towards the tropics. They didn't disappear everywhere, but they became restricted to the tropics. And a lot of the jungles were replaced by a new type of landscape, covered with a new type of plant that was good at living in colder temperatures and in more arid conditions. They were small, they were fast growing. And these are plants very familiar to us. These are grasses. But grasses are actually one of the newest major plant groups that have evolved. And grasslands, vast expanses of grasses, prairies or steppes or whatever we want to call them, these are probably the newest major landscape in Earth history. Only about 20 million years ago were the very first grasslands. A T-Rex, a Brontosaurus would have never seen a grassland. A Brontosaurus would have never eaten a blade of grass. These are new kids on the block in terms of evolution. Now, as the jungles in many parts of the world turned to more open grassland, mammals adapted. Mammals evolved to live on that grassland. And there were a whole lot of hoofed mammals that evolved the ability to run really fast, cover large distances, and so on. And in fact, if you were in North America, if you were in Europe, between about 10 and 20 million years ago or so, you could go on safari. So in the middle of America, basically where I'm from, there used to be rhinos and camels and horses and elephants, all kinds of fantastic mammals. And we often find their fossils in these places where the Yellowstone volcano, when it would erupt, would bury ecosystems. There's a famous site in Nebraska, the Ashfall fossil beds here. Now, as these plant-eating hoofed mammals evolved in the open grasslands, new groups of meat-eaters evolved to feed on them. And some of these animals were terrifying, things that we call bear dogs, like they're a combination of the two groups. But really what we have here are some of the cousins and ancestors of today's dogs and cats and other meat-eating mammals. Now that's what was happening in North America as the temperature cooled. It was happening in Europe and Asia as well. But things were different south of the equator, and especially in Australia, which back then, like today, was an island continent, a land all to its own. And there's some famous fossil sites in the outback, deep in the outback, challenging places to work and collect fossils, but they have beautiful fossils showing what mammals were doing this during this time. And you don't have camels and horses and elephants in Australia. You don't have these big open grasslands yet. Instead, you have lots of marsupial mammals, the ones that give birth to tiny babies that they raise in pouches. And I mentioned earlier, there's not many marsupials alive today. Most are living in Australia and South America. But back during the time of dinosaurs, there were lots of marsupials or their close relatives living across the world. The extinction knocked them back, and they became essentially restricted to the island continents of South America and Australia. South America was an island continent then as well. It was only about 2.5 million years ago that South America and North America docked at the Isthmus of Panama. Until then, South America was isolated for many tens of millions of years. So both South America and Australia, some marsupials managed to escape there. They essentially became marooned, and they evolved in isolation into these many remarkable species. And that's what you see in the fossil record of Australia. Now, meanwhile, the Earth continues to change, the continents continue to move around, and that global cooling, that gradual process of the Earth getting colder, about 2.5 million years ago, this went into overdrive. And this is when the Ice Age started, the Ice Age. There have been many Ice Ages in Earth history. This is the one that we call the Ice Age. And what this was that the Earth's climate got so cold that the polar ice cap at the North Pole grew so much that it extended down onto the continent. And it grew and it retreated and grew and retreated many times over. But many, many times, including, 20,000 years ago or so, where I am in Edinburgh right now, would have been covered with a mile thickness of ice. Incredible world. It would have looked something like this. Edinburgh. Chicago would have looked something like this. Not the mountains in Chicago, but it's just shocking to think about this, and this wasn't that long ago. Now, mammals adapted to this world, and this is where many of the famous megafauna mammals, woolly mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, but also armadillos the size of cars, sloths that stood 10 feet tall, beavers as big as humans, deer with antlers the size of dinner table, all kinds of large, furry, magnificent mammals prospered during the Ice Age. And almost all of them are now extinct. They are gone. And most of them went extinct fairly rapidly around 10,000 years ago, give or take. And it's a mystery. What happened to these things? Well, part of the story probably has something to do with another type of mammal that was evolving and spreading around at this time. This was a new type of mammal that encountered the megafauna, hunted the megafauna, were inspired by the megafauna, drew paintings of mammoths and other giant mammals on cave walls. And these, of course, were humans, our ancestors, primates that came down from the trees in Africa about 5 or 6 million years ago, started to walk upright, evolved bigger brains, evolved dexterous hands that could make tools, eventually becoming our species, Homo sapiens. Now, our species goes back about 300,000 years. That's the oldest fossil Homo sapiens that's known. And those are from Africa. The early history, not just of the human lineage of these apes that came down from the trees, but also our specific species, Homo sapiens, is all on Africa. But different human groups would move out of Africa, spread around. And so 300,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens, our species, evolved, they stayed in Africa for a while, but then they moved on, some of them. They're animals, they migrated. And as Homo sapiens left Africa and moved northwards, closer to the glaciers in Europe, in Asia, they would not have confronted just a world of mammoths and saber-toothed tigers. That was frightening enough. But they also would have encountered other humans, Neanderthals, and other human species that had evolved in Africa previously and spread outwards. And it was only about 40,000 years ago, with the extinction of the Neanderthals, maybe in part caused by us. We also interbreeded with them. We were such close relatives. But it's 40,000 years ago that pure Neanderthals disappear, leaving only us, Homo sapiens, a single human species alone on the earth, contemplating our history and our place in the universe. Now, over the last several decades, we've become an interstellar species. We are still migrating, moving, dreaming of new frontiers. And it's hard to know what the history of humanity holds, because we're putting a lot of pressure on the earth right now. And it's no exaggeration to say that right now is the most perilous time in the history of mammals since our ancestors stared down that asteroid 66 million years ago. As our species, Homo sapiens, have moved around the world, about 5% of other mammals have gone extinct. Now, maybe that number seems small, but to me, that's a big number. We're talking about stuff that's happened really only over the course of a few thousand years. And those are just extinctions. full-out extinctions. I'm not talking about the number of mammals that are endangered. A huge number are endangered today and barely holding on. So we are a remarkable mammal. We have evolved through the normal process of mammal evolution, and here we are, though, affecting the world like no mammal before. And it's a bit harrowing, but I do hope that those things evolution has endowed us with, big brains, intelligence, consciousness, the ability to work together in groups, these things that stemmed from our primate ancestors as we came down from the trees, that those things can help us better understand our world and better mitigate the harm that we are doing. So with that, I will end, and I am very happy to take any questions that anybody may have for the next 10-15 minutes or so until we have to run. So thank you all for your attention, and I hope that gave a bit of a new and fun perspective on the deepest history of us and our cousins.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was fascinating. I had no idea that mammals were that small. It was amazing seeing the jawbone compared to the grain of rice. Well, at the moment, we don't have any questions in the chat, but if anyone wants to input their questions now, we can wait a few minutes and see if any come in.
Yes, and so yeah, you can certainly put things in the chat, or if anybody just wants to speak up, that's perfectly fine as well.
Yeah, I don't think there's the option for people to speak up.
Okay.
But if they want to, if you put a message in the chat, I can, I think, click on your profile and let you talk. So yeah, if anyone would rather ask a question vocally, I can do that. Just ping a message. Oh, since there's one question that's just come through now.
Here we go. Okay, Roy's question about the current theory is how the monkeys got to South America. That's a great question because, as I mentioned just in passing, until 2.5 million years ago, South America was an island continent. It had separated from the other continents back during the age of dinosaurs, and it remained an island on its own until just 2.5 million years ago. Yet there's a pretty nice diversity of mammals on South America. Some have come from North America more recently, but there have been monkeys on South America for many tens of millions of years, and we know that from fossils. So somehow monkeys got to South America when it was an island. The crazy story is we can look at the DNA of the monkeys that are in South America today, and we can tell that their closest relatives are from Africa. And the fossils bear this out. The fossils of South American monkeys have affinities, clear affinities with African monkeys. So somehow some monkeys, and this may have happened a few different times, came over from Africa to South America. There's really only two ways it could have happened. They could have gone by land, and it would have been a very complicated journey of crossing lots of little seaways and other things, going north into Europe, across to North America and down, but that would be very difficult. And there's no fossil record of any monkeys kind of in those other areas making that journey. By far the simpler explanation is that some of these monkeys would have rafted over. They would have crossed the ocean. And the prevailing idea is that there may have been storms, for instance, that ripped apart big mats of vegetation. And sometimes these things, we see them in the world today, they're basically big floating islands ripped off from the land. Those may have traversed the Atlantic and docked in South America, bringing the monkeys with them. It's really the only good idea that seems to make any sense. I talk about it more in the book. I explore it a little bit more and give references to the scientific studies that show that. Okay, let me see. Let me just get the chat up. So Gareth is asking if you can tell us about some of the mammals that I've described and named. Yes, I've done more descriptive work on dinosaurs and have named more dinosaurs, but I have named some mammals along with colleagues. We always do this work with colleagues, and so I'm part of a team that does a lot of field work in New Mexico. My good friend Tom Williamson is a curator in Albuquerque, fossil mammal expert. He's really the leader of the group. And so we've collected a lot of mammals over the years. We found some new species. There was one that we found and we described a little under a decade ago that we called Kimbatopsilus. We gave it the nickname the primeval beaver, not because it is a beaver, but it's a mammal that was living soon after the asteroid. And it was about the size of a beaver. It was a plant eater. It was kind of evolving a beaver-like lifestyle, showing how some of these first mammals after the asteroid were adapting so quickly. And there have been others from New Mexico as well. We've actually described and named some new species of early marsupial relatives that were living with the dinosaurs in the Cretaceous period in New Mexico. By the way, I tell the story of the discovery of Kimbatopsilus, the primeval beaver, in the book, and it's a cool story because it was not me who discovered it. It wasn't Tom, it wasn't the curator, the professor, the PhD. It was a student, an undergrad, on her first fossil hunting expedition who found this totally new species, which was really cool. Let's see. So Rowena's asking diapsid and mammal evolutions at different periods.
Can you see the Q&A tab, Steve? Otherwise I can read out too.
Okay. I see. There's two. Okay. Yes, great.
Sorry for the confusion.
Yes, no problem. So you know what happened to the surviving diapsid, like crocodiles and turtles and mammals were undergoing evolution ice ages, or is that another story? They seem to have changed less than the mammals. It's definitely another story. And they changed a lot, really, because that diapsid group, that includes dinosaurs. So all that aspect of dinosaur evolution, brontosaurs, T-Rexes, that was all part of the evolution of diapsids during this same time interval I covered today. So there's a huge richness of diapsids. There's a lot of stories to tell, but they underwent their own crazy evolution during this time. And I'll just go through those other questions. So Vicky's asking, why did humans become hairless? I don't know. I mean, certainly our closest living relatives, which are chimpanzees, are covered in hair. We think that some of these first fossil members of the human lineage would have had a lot more hair than we do. But I don't really know. I'm sure that anthropologists have ideas for why humans lost most of their hair, whether it has to do with the climates we lived in, whether it has to do with aspects of mating and reproduction. A lot of things with soft tissues and depend on those. I don't know. So I don't know the answer. I'm sure that there's an answer out there. It's so far from my specialty, human evolution. I had to learn a lot about human evolution to write the one chapter in the book about it. And I would say it's certainly the subject I know the least about. And there's such a huge amount of research and literature on human evolution. So I'm frankly kind of a dilettante when it comes to human evolution. So it's a great question. I have a feeling I'm going to be looking that up later today. Adam's asking, did bats evolve flight similar to how birds evolved it, or is it a different but similar mechanism? We know a lot about how birds evolve flight. That'll be my next book, by the way. I'm writing one on birds now. I'm actually, like literally, almost literally as we speak, like today, I'm doing some research on the origin of bird flight. I'm writing up some of these chapters about how a dinosaur became a flying bird. We have lots of transitional species of fossils of dinosaurs and early birds that kind of capture, kind of like the evolution of whales from hoofed mammals, that capture that transition. Not every step, but enough of the steps that we can see that bird flight evolved from small, fast-running, fast-growing, potentially tree-climbing, carnivorous dinosaurs, like the raptor dinosaurs. For bats, we don't have a transitional sequence of fossils at all. We don't have any primitive bat fossils. We don't have fossils of like early relatives of bats that are like evolving, half a wing or something like that. When the first bat fossils show up in the fossil record, they are already undoubtedly bats. They have full-on wings. They could already fly. So this is one of the great mysteries of mammal evolution. How did bats evolve flight? And we just really don't know. And we are awaiting the fossils. And that's what it comes down to. We need to find the fossils. And the problem is that the first bats were probably very small. They had very delicate skeletons. It's hard to turn animals like that into a fossil. But they're probably out there somewhere, waiting to be found. Let's see. Sarah asked about more books. Yep, there you go, the bird book. So I have about a year to write it, but it should be out hopefully in 2026. And this one is fun because, people love birds and so many bird watchers out there. And I think the story of the evolution of birds, how birds came to be, how they evolved from dinosaurs, what a tremendous story that is. I don't think that's told very often, so I hope to give a fresh take on that. Now another question about, did all species of cetaceans, so whales and dolphins, come from one species, or many that returned to the sea from the land? As far as we know, it was a single ancestor or a single ancestral sequence that led to today's whales and dolphins. But there were other groups of mammals that also evolved from land ancestors that went into the water. Seals, manatees, are some examples. So it has happened a few times over. And there's reptiles that have done it as well. There were all these reptiles that lived at the time of dinosaurs that were living in the ocean. They evolved from land ancestors too. It's actually a common theme in evolution. Asking about chickens and which dinosaur are they most closely related to? They're equally closely related to all the dinosaurs you know. So modern day birds, chickens, ducks, pigeons, ostriches, eagles, falcons, all those things, they share a single common ancestor. And that ancestor probably lived right towards the end of the age of dinosaurs. So that means that all modern birds, because they're in their own group, are equally closely related to T-Rex, Brontosaurus, and so on. However, if you're asking really not a strict genealogical question, but more like which dinosaurs were most similar to things like chickens, we're talking about things like the raptor dinosaurs, Velociraptor. The real Velociraptor was only about the size of a miniature poodle. It was a small, little, fast-running, feisty creature. All right, let's see. Just trying to see if there's any more here.
I think that's all the questions we've got. So unless anyone else has any last-minute questions to put in the chat, I have one question.
Yeah.
If you could predict how mammals will evolve 1 million years from now, what kind of crazy sort of creatures are we going to see?
As a paleontologist, I'm very comfortable looking into the past. I'm less comfortable predicting the future. But the thing is, the world is changing so quickly today, climates especially, that we are getting into the realm of unpredictability. What I will say is that there have been times of global warming in the past. What's happening now is quicker than any of those that we know of. Also, the cause is different. It's us and releasing hydrocarbons and such into the atmosphere. But global warming has happened before from volcanoes and other things. And oftentimes what we see when temperatures rise is that animals, especially mammals, get smaller. It's just easier to be a smaller mammal when it's hot. There's less chance of overheating, essentially. It's a bit more complicated than that, but essentially, not all mammals get small. But the last time there was a big global warming episode, about 40% of mammals dwarfed in size. So it's a pretty common thing. My guess would be you're going to be seeing a lot smaller mammals. Maybe even humans will get smaller. There have been dwarf species of humans that lived in the past that when different humans kind of got marooned on islands, they would get smaller in size. So we are capable of dwarfing too if the environment demands it. So I do have a feeling it's going to be harder for bigger mammals to survive and that some mammals might end up going small, but we will see.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Steve. Thank you. That was an amazing talk. I really enjoyed it. Unless anyone else has any questions, I think we'll wrap up. So, and just a reminder, we have more webinars every day this week, and also to participate in the Big Mammal Challenge if you all want to. Thank you again.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of the day, good rest of Mammal Week, and keep in touch. And if you have any questions or you read the book, you want to know anything, my email is pretty easy to find. So take care.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.